Good evening, wherever you're listening from tonight, and welcome to the Sleepy History. I'm glad you're here. Somewhere, very long ago, in a house whose name we will never know, a single oil lamp is being lit against the coming dark. The wick catches slowly, a small flame steadies itself, then leans, then holds. Its light spreads only a little way, just far enough to soften the edges of a low doorway, to warm the cool stone floor, to touch the folded cloth resting in a corner. Outside, the street is settling. A last cart passes, a dog answers another somewhere further off. And inside this one room, the day is quietly ending, the way days have ended for thousands of years. If this slow journey into the ancient world helps you unwind tonight, you might consider subscribing and leaving a like on the video. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from this evening. It's always a quiet comfort to know who is resting alongside these old stories. There's nothing more for you to do now. You can let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and simply listen. Tonight, we are not going to remain in one city, one kingdom, or even one century. Instead, we will move gently across different parts of the ancient world, noticing the quiet ways families protected their reputation, memory, and place within their communities. Around them, kingdoms rose, borders shifted, and famous names were carved into monuments, meant to outlast the people who ordered them. But far below all of that, beneath the noise of grand history, there were countless small rooms like this one, rooms with a lamp, a threshold, little warmth held against the night. And in each of them, an ordinary family was doing something quiet and constant, something that rarely made it into any record at all. They were tending to their name, not their fame, not their glory, something humbler and, in its way, more tender. A family's name, in the ancient world, was a living thing. It held who they were to their neighbours, how they were trusted at the market, whether their word would be believed, whether their children would be welcomed. It stretched backward toward the people who had come before them and forward toward the ones not yet born. And it had to be cared for, gently and daily, the way you might tend a small flame that must not be allowed to go out. We tend to imagine that reputation belonged to the powerful, to those grand enough to be remembered. But the truth, as far as the incomplete evidence allows us to see it, is softer and more widespread than that. Across many ancient communities, people of very different circumstances had some form of standing, memory, or belonging that could be protected or lost in their own particular way. So before we step further into these old rooms, it helps to pause on a simple question, one that shaped so much of ordinary life. What did a name really mean to the people who carried it? To us, a name is often just a label, a word written at the top of a form spoken in a room when we enter, worn lightly and set aside. But in the ancient world, for many people across many cultures, a name carried a great deal more than that. It was less a label than a kind of inheritance, something you received, tended, and eventually handed on. Picture for a moment some small sign by which a household might be known, a mark, an emblem, a familiar doorway, or simply the memory neighbours attached to the people who lived there. Such signs did more than identify a home. They placed a family within the life of the community, quietly suggesting that this household belonged to this place, held a standing among its neighbours, and was known. And to be known, in a small community, was to be woven into a web of trust and expectation that touched almost every part of daily life. A name told others whether your word could be relied upon, whether the grain you sold was honest, whether the debt you promised to repay would be repaid, whether your family kept its agreements. Even where contracts, witnesses, or written records existed, daily life still depended heavily on personal trust. A good name was therefore, in a real sense, a kind of wealth. It opened doors that no coin could open, and a damaged name could close them just as firmly. We sometimes imagine ancient reputation as the grand thing of legend, the noble house with its shining honour, its heroic ancestors, its name sung by poets. And such houses did exist, or at least such stories were told about them. But that is the myth more than the reality. For most families, the truth was quieter and more constant. Their name was not sung, it was simply kept day after day through small and ordinary acts, the way a fire is kept by feeding it a little at a time. A name also stretched across time in a way that could feel almost weightless and yet mattered enormously. It reached backward to the ancestors whose choices had shaped how the family was seen. And it reached forward too, into children not yet grown and children not yet born. When an elder taught a young child to say the name of a grandparent, they were passing something along, a thread meant to continue after they themselves were gone. None of this looked the same everywhere. What a name meant, and how much it could carry depended on class, on place, on legal status, on the wealth of the household, and on the particular century a person happened to live in. Elite sources tell us most, and they do not speak for everyone. The evidence is incomplete, and ordinary lives must often be reconstructed with care. Still, one thread runs through it. A name was carried, and it was carried by people, which leads us gently to the question of who exactly held it. A name may have belonged to a family, but a family was never a single thing. It was a gathering of people, each one holding a small thread of the whole, each one able to strengthen it or, without meaning to fray it. Return again to that lamplit room. Around its soft circle of light, imagine the people who might have lived there. An elder, perhaps, seated a little closer to the warmth of the hearth, watched over and consulted, a keeper of the family's older memories. Parents, moving through the last tasks of the evening. Children, half asleep near the wall, or lingering at the threshold where the last of the outside light still glowed. And in many households, though not all, there were others too, servants, or those held in slavery, whose labour sustained the home even as their own names and stories were rarely written down. Each of these people, in their own way, carried a part of how the family was seen. The elder's fairness in a dispute, remembered by neighbours long after, the way the children behaved at the well, or in the narrow lane, or before the eyes of a visiting relative, the steadiness of the parents' dealings in the market. A single household spoke to the wider world through many voices and many small actions, most of them ordinary, most of them unremarked. It is tempting to think of the family in these old worlds as a smooth, unified whole, a single face turned outward, and in some ways it was. A family often acted as one, and its reputation rose or fell together. But behind that shared face were individual people, each with their own dignity, their own quiet burdens, their own sense of what was right. The pressure to uphold the family's standing was real, and it could weigh heavily. Yet within that pressure, ordinary people still made their own small choices, still held themselves in their own way, still mattered as more than a role. We should be gentle with our certainties here. The people we can see most clearly in the surviving evidence tend to be the heads of households, the propertied, the literate, those whose names outlived them. The rest, the greater number, appear only in glimpses if at all. A child mentioned once, a servant named in a list, a wife known chiefly through the words of others. Their inner lives are largely lost to us, and it would be a kindness to remember that when we imagine them, we are reconstructing far more than we can prove. Even so, the shape of the thing is clear enough. Protecting a name was never the work of one person alone. It was a shared and quiet labour, spread across many hands and many days, held together by the simple fact of living under one roof. And that roof, that ordinary shelter of walls and doorway and hearth, was more than a backdrop to their lives. It was, in its own way, the very place where a family's name was kept safe. A house is easy to overlook. We tend to see it as a container, a set of walls that simply holds the more important business of living. But in the ancient world, the home was rarely so passive a thing. It was, in a quiet way, a keeper of the family's name, a place where reputation was made, protected, and slowly stored. Stand for a moment at the threshold of such a house. Beneath your feet, a worn stone step smoothed by years of comings and goings. Before you, a wooden door, and beyond it the dim interior where the day's light gives way to lamplight. Off to one side, perhaps, a small courtyard open to the evening sky, folded textiles resting where they were left, the faint warmth of a hearth that has not yet gone cold, all of it ordinary, all of it, in its own way, holding the memory of the people who lived there. The house showed the world a face. What could be seen from the street, the doorway, the entrance, the little signs of care or neglect, spoke quietly on the family's behalf before anyone said a word. And behind that face was the private life that few outsiders ever fully saw, the routines, the small kindnesses, the disagreements settled and forgotten, the daily habits that either strengthened a family's good name or, over time, wore it thin. The gap between the two, the face shown and the life lived, was where much of the real work of a household took place. We should be careful not to imagine every home the same. A house varied enormously with wealth, with region, with the century, with the standing of those inside it. Some were spacious and layered, with rooms for many purposes. Others were a single shared space, warm and crowded, where every part of life happened close together. The evidence we have leans toward the larger and better kept homes, simply because those tend to survive. The humbler dwellings, where most people actually lived, must often be imagined more than seen. Yet, whatever its size, the home carried something no record could fully capture. It held the accumulated memory of a family, the place where children were named and raised, where elders were tended, where the small objects of ordinary life gathered meaning through use. Generations could pass beneath one roof, and the walls, in their silent way, remembered them all. So when we speak of a family protecting its name, we are speaking in large part of what happened inside these ordinary shelters, not in the grand spaces of history, but here, in rooms lit by a single lamp, where the quiet work of belonging was done a little at a time. And it is here that our journey truly begins to slow and settle. For to understand how a name was kept, we must step through that wooden door and move gently through the spaces within, beginning at the very edge of the home, at the doorway that faced the world. A doorway is the smallest of borders, and yet it holds two worlds apart. On one side, the street, with its dust and voices and the eyes of neighbours. On the other, the private life of the household, warm and hidden. In the ancient world, this narrow line, this threshold of stone or worn timber, was where a family met the world each day, and where the world in turn quietly took the family's measure. Rest your attention on such a doorway for a while. The frame perhaps a little smoke-darkened, the hinge that has creaked in the same low note for years, the step below it, hollowed by the passage of countless feet, a hand resting on the frame as someone pauses before going out or coming in. Small things, ordinary things, and yet a doorway was rarely only practical. It was, in many homes, a place given meaning. In some households, and here customs varied greatly across cultures and centuries, the threshold was treated as something close to sacred. A small charm might hang beside it, or a mark be made upon the frame, meant to guard those within and to bless those who crossed. Elsewhere, such things were simply habit, done because they had always been done, their older meanings softened by time into a comforting routine. Either way the door was tended, it was not left bare and forgotten. It carried a quiet message about the people inside, for the doorway spoke on the family's behalf. Kept clean, kept in good repair, marked with care, it told the passing neighbour that here lived a household that minded itself, that took its place in the community seriously. Neglected, it might whisper something else. This was the face the family chose to show, the presentation offered to the street, and a presentation is, by its nature, only part of the truth, because beyond that threshold lay the lived-in interior, the real and unpolished daily life that no visitor at the door could see. The doorway showed order. Inside there might be worry, or weariness, or the ordinary muddle of a house full of people. The gap between the tended entrance and the true life within was not deception exactly. It was simply the difference between how family wished to be seen and how it actually lived, a difference every household has always known. We should not overstate what the evidence allows. Much of what we imagine about ancient doorways comes from wealthier homes and from the customs recorded by those who wrote things down. The humbler thresholds, where most people passed their days, survive far less clearly. What we can say gently is that the door mattered in ways both practical and quietly symbolic, more than its plain appearance might suggest. So we pause here a moment longer at the edge of the home, one hand on the frame before we step across. Because once inside, the world of the street falls away, and we come to the warm centre around which everything else was arranged, the hearth and its patient, living fire. Step inside, past the threshold and its quiet guardianship, and you come to the warm centre of the home. In many ancient houses, everything seemed to arrange itself around one place, the hearth. It was where food was cooked and where warmth gathered, but it was also, in a deeper sense, the still heart of the household, the point from which the family's daily life radiated outward. Let the fire hold your attention for a while, the embers glowing low and orange beneath a soft grey coat of ash. The stones around it hold the heat, growing warmer as the hours pass, a thin ribbon of smoke rising toward an opening above or drifting along the ceiling before it finds its way out. A pot of grain simmering slowly, giving off a plain and comforting smell. And beneath it all that faint, familiar sound, the soft crackle and settle of burning wood, a sound so old and so human that it needs no explanation. Tending this fire was daily work, and in many traditions it was more than that. To keep a flame alive from one day to the next, to bank the embers at night so they might be coaxed back to life at dawn, was a small and constant duty that fell to particular hands within the household, often the women who kept the home. In some cultures, this fire carried real meaning tied to the family's continuity, even to its ancestors, so that letting it die entirely could feel like more than an inconvenience. In others, the fire may have carried little symbolism beyond its practical use. Even so, wherever a household depended on it for cooking, warmth or light, its steadiness mattered, and there is something quietly telling in that. A family's name, too, was kept much like a fire, not through grand gestures, but through steady, patient attention, day after day, so that it never went cold. The flame that was fed each morning and banked each night was, in its way, a small mirror of the care a family gave its own good standing. Both had to be tended. Both could be lost through neglect. Both gave warmth to more than one generation. The meaning of the hearth was never identical from one household or culture to another. Homes differed enormously. A wealthier household might have a fixed hearth in a room built around it, while a humbler dwelling made do with a simpler arrangement, and in warmer places the fire's role shifted with the climate and the season. The customs and the beliefs attached to fire varied from culture to culture and changed across the centuries. What the evidence allows us to say gently is only this, that the hearth was rarely just a stove. It carried comfort, and often meaning, well beyond the heat it gave. Around this fire, the hard edges of a difficult day could soften. Whatever weariness or worry had followed the family in from the street, there was warmth here, and food, and the plain reassurance of familiar light. It was a small comfort, but small comforts repeated are how lives are held together. And when at last the fire was banked low for the night, the household turned toward rest, to the quiet rooms where the family lay down and slept. When the fire had been banked low and the last tasks of the day were done, the household turned towards sleep. And where a family slept and how can tell us something gentle and true about the shape of their lives if we look at it softly. In many ancient homes, sleep was not the private, separated thing it often is for us. People rested close together, sometimes several to a room, sometimes nearly all the household within a single shared space. Beds might be low frames of wood, or simply mats and folded cloth laid upon the floor, blankets of wool, a cushion stuffed with whatever was to hand, the warmth of another person nearby. The room dim, lit at most by a single lamp burning down toward its last, its small flame throwing soft and shifting shadows before it too went dark. We should not imagine this the same for everyone. Comfort varied enormously, with wealth, with region, with the century. A prosperous household might have a room set aside for rest, with better bedding and a measure of quiet. A poorer family may do with far less, close-packed and plain. The evidence we have tends to favour the better off, whose furnishings sometimes survive, while the humbler arrangements, where most people actually lay down each night, must largely be imagined. What we can say with care is only that sleep for many was a shared and close affair. And there is a quiet tenderness in that closeness. Sleep is the most vulnerable part of the day. It is the hours when we let go of watchfulness, when we trust the walls around us and the people within them to keep us safe until morning. To lie down among others, breathing slowly in the dark, it was to place a kind of faith in one another. The child near the wall, the elder resting close to the last of the warmth, the parents nearby, all of them, for a few hours, simply trusting. That nightly gathering was its own small binding. It asked nothing grand, only presence, only the ordinary act of resting under one roof. Yet these repeated nights, one after another across the years, quietly strengthened the bonds a family depended upon. A household that rested together, that trusted one another in the dark, was a household knit a little more firmly against the world outside. And such quiet trust, unspoken and unrecorded, was part of what upheld a family's good name. For a family at peace within itself tends to show a steadier face to its neighbours. Notice, too, the small dignity in how little was needed. Few possessions, perhaps, but those few arranged with care. The blanket folded rather than flung, the mat kept clean, the lamp set where it could be reached. Within real limits, ordinary people still shaped their small corner of the world, still made of it something ordered and their own. So the house grows still, the breathing slows, the last lamp gutters and goes out, and in the morning when the light returns, the household will rise and open its doors again, and there will be a place, however modest, kept ready for those who come to visit. When morning came and the household stirred back to life, there was one part of the home that carried a particular weight. When space and circumstance allowed, a household might prepare a room, a corner, or simply a swept and ready place for receiving visitors. Here, an outsider could be welcomed, and here, quietly, the family might also be judged. This was where the household turned its private life outward and offered its best. Picture the small preparations, a good textile spread across the seating, chosen because it was the finest the family owned, a vessel of water poured for a guest to refresh themselves, a cup passed from hand to hand, low seats or cushions arranged with a little more care than usual, and over it all, the soft fall of lamplight on the faces of those gathered, softening the room, making it feel warm and complete. In many ancient societies, welcoming a guest well carried real social importance. Hospitality was woven deeply into the customs of the time, sometimes tied to belief, sometimes to plain social expectation, often to both. To receive a visitor generously, to offer food and drink and a place to rest, was to show that your household was decent, capable, and worthy of respect. And what a guest experienced within your walls did not stay within them. It travelled. The visitor carried away an impression, and that impression became part of what neighbours said, and what neighbours said became part of the family's name. So hospitality was kindness genuinely, but it was also quietly a kind of strategy. A family that welcomed others warmly protected its standing far beyond the single evening in question. The shared cup, the offered water, the best cloth brought out from wherever it was kept. These were gestures of real warmth and, at the same time, careful investments in how the household would be spoken of when the guest had gone. There is a gentle tension in that, and it is worth sitting with rather than judging. On one side, the social pressure to perform, to present the family well, to meet the expectations that visitors and neighbours carried. On the other, the simple personal dignity of genuine welcome, the honest pleasure of feeding someone, of making a tired traveller comfortable, of being, for an evening, a good host. In most homes, surely the two are not really separate. Kindness and reputation ran together, each strengthening the other. This picture changes considerably with wealth, place and period. Much of what we know of ancient hospitality comes from those who wrote, who tended to be the more prosperous, and their customs were not everyone's. The manners of a wealthy household and those of a poor one differed, as did practices across regions and centuries. The evidence is uneven, and the humbler welcomes are the ones we glimpse least clearly. Still, the shape holds. The home showed its face at the door, kept its warmth at the hearth, held its trust in sleep, and offered its best to guests. And through all of these spaces moved a family's name. Yet a name lived not only in rooms and routines, it lived too in the small objects a family kept and handled, the quiet things that carried memory in their very substance. A small object can carry a weight far greater than its size. In households involved in property, storage, trade, or formal agreements, one especially meaningful object might be a seal, a small piece of carved stone or metal that could stand for the authority of a person, office, or household. Hold the idea of it in your mind for a moment. A seal might be a small carved stone worn smooth from handling, its design cut carefully into one face. It might be set into a ring worn on the finger, or threaded onto a cord and kept close against the body, tucked beneath a garment where it would not be lost. When pressed into soft clay, or, in some places and periods, wax, it left a small distinct impression associated with its owner, office, or household, and that impression carried authority. It could close a jar so that any tampering would show. It could bind an agreement. It could mark a possession as truly one's own. There is something quietly remarkable in that. In a world where written signatures as we know them were not always possible or common, this little pressed image did the work of trust. To see a family's seal upon a sealed document or a stored good was to know whose word stood behind it. The mark meant this is ours, this is agreed, this may be relied upon. A tiny object, and yet it spoke on behalf of everyone in the household. Which is exactly why such a thing was guarded closely. A seal misused could do real harm. In the wrong hands, that trusted mark might be pressed to something false, binding a family to a promise it never made, or vouching for goods it never sent. To lose a seal, or to have it taken, was more than the loss of a small carved stone. It was a threat to the family's very ability to be believed. And so, the records that survive suggest, seals were kept carefully, entrusted to particular hands, passed from one trusted person to the next with real attention. Seals did not serve the same purpose everywhere. Seals and signet marks appear across many ancient cultures, but their forms, their meanings, and who was permitted to hold them varied a great deal with place, class, and century. They belonged more often to those with property and dealings to conduct, and much of what we know leans toward such households. The poorer families, whose transactions left fewer traces, are harder to see. The evidence is partial, as it so often is, and yet the human truth within it is easy to feel. Here was an entire family's name and word, its trustworthiness, its standing distilled into an object small enough to hold in a closed hand. A whole world of relationships and reputation pressed into a fragment of stone. But not every mark of a family was made of stone or metal. Some were softer, warmer, worn against the body every day, read by neighbours at a glance. For a family's standing was written too in the cloth it wore, and some of what a family wished to say about itself was never spoken at all. It was worn. In the ancient world, cloth spoke a quiet, constant language, and those who passed a family in the lane or met them at the market could read a great deal in the garments they wore. Consider the making of it first, for cloth did not simply appear. It began with raw wool or flax carded and spun into thread, then worked slowly on a loom, row upon patient row. In many households this was the labour of women, hours upon hours of it, fitted around every other task of the day. The threads pulled taut, the shuttle passing back and forth, the steady growth of the fabric, a hand's width at a time. It was work that asked skill and endurance, and it was rarely praised, though the whole family was clothed by it. And what that cloth became said something, the fineness of the weave, whether tight and even or loose and rough. The rarity of a dye, for certain colours were difficult and costly to produce, and so quietly announced a family that could afford them, while plainer undyed cloth spoke of humbler means. The care of the mending, too, was read, for a garment kept whole and neatly repaired told of a household that minded itself, while one left ragged might whisper of neglect or hardship. Neighbours noticed these things without seeming to. Cloth was a language everyone understood. Clothing did not communicate status through one universal code. What cloth signified and what dyes or styles marked status differed enormously across cultures, regions, and centuries. In some places, certain colours carried particular meaning, in others they did not. The evidence we have often favours the finer textiles, which sometimes survive or are described, while the everyday cloth of poorer people, worn until it wore away, is far harder to trace. Much must be pieced together carefully. Yet within all these differences a gentle truth holds. There was real dignity in what modest hands could make. A family of small means could not command rare dyes or costly weaves, but it could keep its cloth clean, its garments mended, its work done well, and in that lay a quiet kind of agency. Within the limits of what they had, ordinary people shaped how they appeared to the world. The plain garment, cared for and kept whole, carried its own honest pride. There is something moving, too, in the endurance of a single well-made garment. Cloth was precious, not lightly replaced. A good piece might be worn for years, then mended, then passed to another, carrying the family's care in every stitch. It softened with use, took the shape of the body, gathered the memory of the wearer. Long service, not novelty, was the mark of value, so a family wore it standing quietly, thread by thread, and neighbours read it at a glance. But some objects a family kept were not worn or worked at all. They were held and treasured and passed carefully from one generation to the next, carrying memory in a different way. Among the possessions of a household, a few objects held a meaning that had nothing to do with their usefulness or their worth in coin. These were the things kept not because they were needed, but because of who they had belonged to, the heirlooms, the quiet vessels of memory handed carefully from one generation to the next. Such an object might be nothing grand, a cup, its surface worn smooth by years of use, a bowl, perhaps chipped a little at the rim, still brought out on certain days, a small ornament, its metal darkened with age, its shine long faded. To a stranger these things might seem plain, even unremarkable, but within the family they carried a presence. They had been held by a grandmother, used at meals now long past, touched by hands that were no longer there, and in that they became something more than themselves. There is a particular tenderness in this. To hold an object that an ancestor once held is to feel, for a moment, a thread stretching back through time. The smooth handle worn by another's grip, the cup lifted once by lips you never knew but somehow belonged to. These were not relics displayed for others. They were intimate things kept in a chest or a corner, brought out quietly, their meaning known chiefly to the family itself. Through them, someone gone could still, in a small way, remain present, and so inheritance in the ancient world was never only a matter of property and wealth, though it was certainly that as well. It was also the passing of memory. When such an object came into a new generation's keeping, when it was placed perhaps into a child's small and careful hands, something more than a possession changed owners. A piece of the family's story moved forward. The child, in receiving it, received also a quiet lesson, that they belonged to something older than themselves, that they too were part of a line that reached both backward and ahead. We should hold this gently, as ever, and not assume it looked the same everywhere. What objects were treasured, how inheritance worked, and what meanings were attached to keepsakes varied a great deal across cultures, classes, and centuries. Wealthier families left more traces of such things, while the humblest households, whose few possessions rarely survived, are harder to see. The sentimental lives of ordinary people must often be imagined with care, from small and scattered clues. Yet the human feeling within it needs little proof. It is easy to recognize. Most of us know some small object that matters far beyond its value, kept only because of the hands that held it before ours. In this, at least, the distance of centuries seems to fall away. There is something quietly moving, too, in how such memory survived. No monument was raised, no great name was carved in stone, and yet a family's story lived on, gently, in a worn cup passed between hands. But for some, there was another way to hold a name against forgetting, a way made not of objects but of written words. There was another way a family might hold its name against the slow erosion of time, one that did not depend on cloth or cup or carved seal. In some places, and for some people, a name could be written down, and a written name had a strange and quiet power. It could outlast the person who bore it. Picture the tools of it: a tablet of soft clay, ready to take the press of a stylus, a reed cut to a point, or a pen dipped in ink, a stone waiting to be carved slowly, letter by letter, by a patient hand, and the scribe or the mason bent over the work, forming marks that would hold their meaning long after the ordinary sounds of a household had faded into silence. A name set into clay, or inked onto a surface, or cut into stone, became a small anchor in time, a way of saying this person was here. Such records took many forms. A name might appear in a contract binding an agreement between parties. It might be written in a list, among those who owned or owed or belonged to a place. It might be carved into a dedication, offered at a temple, or set upon a stone that marked a resting place. In each case, the writing did something the spoken word could not. It fixed the name in place. It gave it a permanence that memory alone, fragile and mortal, could never quite promise. But here we must be especially careful and especially gentle. Not every person had access to this kind of permanence. Writing and the people who could produce it were not evenly available. In some cities and some periods, records were common, in others, rare. The families whose names were written down tended to be those with property to record, agreements to formalize, or the means to commission an inscription. The great majority of ordinary people left no written trace of themselves at all. Their names were spoken, remembered for a generation or two, and then, softly, lost. This is one of the quiet sorrows of history, and it deserves acknowledgement. The written record is not a full picture of the people who lived. It leans toward the propertied and the literate, toward those who could afford to be remembered in lasting form. Official documents and inscriptions tell us a great deal, but they do not tell us everyone. Whole lives, whole families, ordinary and decent and real, pass through the world without ever being written into it. The evidence, as always, is incomplete and shaped by who had the means to make it. And yet, for those families who could be recorded, being written down was itself a kind of protection. It was a way of pushing back, however modestly, against the softening erasure that time works upon us all, A name inscribed might be read by someone who never knew the person it named, perhaps centuries later, perhaps by us, tonight. In that small way, the writing kept a faint light burning where otherwise there would only have been the dark. Still, whether written or unwritten, no name was truly kept by objects alone. It was kept by living, by the quiet routines that filled each ordinary day, and to those daily labours we now gently turn. A name was not kept in grand moments, it was kept in mornings, in the small repeated tasks that opened each ordinary day, done so faithfully and so often that no one thought to record them, and yet upon which a family's whole standing quietly rested. Come, then, to the beginning of a day in such a household. The light is only just returning, grey and soft at the edges of the doorway. The house is still cool from the night. Someone rises before the others, as someone always did, and the day's first duties begin. The embers of the hearth, banked low the evening before, are coaxed gently back to life. A water jar is taken up and carried to the well, or the spring, and returned, heavier now, the cool weight of it balanced with practised ease. The floor is swept, and somewhere in it all the plain, comforting smell of the morning's bread begins to rise. There is nothing remarkable in any of this, and that is precisely the point. These were the humblest of tasks, the ones that had to be done again and again, that were never finished, only repeated. Fetching water, tending fire, preparing food, work that fell often to particular hands within the household, frequently the women, and that went almost entirely unpraised. Yet it was this quiet, unglamorous rhythm that held a family together, day after day, and gave its life a steadiness that others could see. For reliability itself was a kind of honour. In a small community where neighbours lived close and noticed much, it mattered which households rose early and set about their work, which kept their small promises, which could be counted upon. A family that met its obligations, that was ready when it needed to be, that did the ordinary things well and without fuss, earned a quiet respect that no single grand gesture could buy. And a household that let its duties slide, that seemed always behind, always in disorder, might find that noticed too. Good standing was built in large part from the faithful keeping of small things. We should not paint this rhythm as gentle for everyone, nor imagine it the same across every home. The weight of the morning's labour varied enormously with wealth, with the size of the household, with the season and the region and the century. In some homes the work was shared among many hands, including those of servants or the enslaved. In others it fell heavily upon a few. What the evidence lets us say is only that such daily labour was constant, and that its burden was rarely spread evenly. And yet, within the hardness of it, there was also a kind of comfort. There is ease to be found in the familiar, in knowing the shape of the day before it begins, in the body moving through tasks it has done 1,000 times. The weight of the water jar was real, but so was the quiet steadiness of a routine that held. The labour was hard, and the rhythm somehow made it bearable. From these first tasks of the morning one led naturally toward another, toward the work that would feed the whole household and, in its own way, speak for it, the making of bread and the gathering at the shared table. Of all the daily labours that filled an ancient household, few mattered more, or were more constant, than the making of food. To feed a family well was the plainest of duties and one of the most important, and to share that food, to keep a table that welcomed others, spoke quietly on the family's behalf in a language everyone understood. Begin with the grain, for so much began there. Before there could be bread, there had to be grinding, and grinding was slow, heavy work. Kernels crushed against stone again and again, the arms and back bearing the effort, until at last there was flour enough. Then the mixing, the shaping, the baking, until the plain and wonderful smell of warm bread filled the room. Water was drawn and poured, clay bowls were set out, and in time the family gathered, often seated low, close together, to eat what those hands had made. There is a whole world of unseen labour behind that simple scene. The bread that appeared each day did not appear on its own. It was the end of a long chain of effort, much of it the work of women, repeated without pause day after day for a lifetime. It was rarely remarked upon, precisely because it was so constant, and yet without it nothing else in the household could go forward. The plainest loaf carried within it hours of quiet work. Food was also quietly a matter of standing. A family known for a full and welcoming table earned a gentle respect among its neighbours. To be able to offer food, to share it generously, to receive a visitor and set something before them, was to show both care and capability. Hospitality and reputation ran together here, as they so often did. What a household could put upon its table, and how freely it shared, said something about who they were, and yet we should be careful here and tender. For behind the welcoming table there was often a private reckoning that guests never saw. Generosity shown outward might sit beside real scarcity within. A family might offer its best to a visitor while carefully measuring what remained for itself. The full table presented to the world was not always the whole truth of the household's stores. There was, in this, a quiet dignity, the choosing to share, to keep up the warmth of welcome, even when means were thin. As always, the picture varied. What people ate, how meals were prepared, and what the shared table meant differed enormously across cultures, classes, regions, and centuries. The abundance of a prosperous household bore little resemblance to the plain fare of a poor one. Much of what we know leans toward those who left records, and the daily meals of ordinary people must often be reconstructed carefully from scattered traces. Still, the human centre of it holds, the gathering to eat, the shared bread broken among familiar faces, the plain comfort of being fed and of feeding others. These were among the deepest of daily acts, and they bound a household together while it faced the world. From feeding the family within, we turn now to the work that carried the family's name beyond its own walls, into the wider world of trade and craft. Beyond the walls of the home, in the wider world of the market and the workshop, a family's name took on another life. For many households, what they made or grew or sold became, over time, inseparable from who they were. A family's craft was often its name, spoken in the marketplace long before any of its members arrived. Think of the small workshops that gathered along the streets of an ancient town, or the plots of land worked patiently beyond its edges. A potter at the wheel, hands wet with clay, shaping vessel after vessel, the fine dust of the trade settling on skin and clothes and floor. A weaver at the loom producing cloth for others. A farmer bringing the fruits of long seasons to a market stall. The tools worn smooth by years of use. The hands themselves shaped by the work, calloused and sure. This was labour that took a lifetime to master, and it was watched quietly by all who bought from it, for reputation in a trade was built slowly and honestly, or not at all. A potter whose vessels held true, who did not overcharge, whose work could be relied upon, earned a standing that spread by word of mouth from one buyer to the next. A farmer known for fair dealing, a weaver known for good cloth, gathered trust the same way, a little at a time, over years. There were no quick paths to it. A good name in the marketplace was the sum of countless honest transactions, each one small, each one remembered, and this reputation, once earned, could be inherited. A child raised in the workshop learned not only the craft but the name that went with it. To be known as the son or daughter of a trusted maker was to begin with something already given, a standing built by a parent's steady labour. In turn, that child would either uphold it or let it slip, for a good name in trade had to be kept as carefully as it had been made. The livelihood and the honour of a family were woven so tightly together that they could hardly be separated at all. The work was the name, and the name was the work. We should hold this gently, as ever. How trades were organised, who could practice them, and how reputation moved through a community varied enormously across cultures, places, and centuries. In some settings, craft passed within families. In others, the picture was more complicated, shaped by law, by status, by the presence of servants and the enslaved whose labour is often hidden in the records. Much of what survives favours certain trades and certain places. The full texture of ordinary working life must be pieced together with care, yet there is quiet dignity in the heart of it. No glory attached to most of this work. No monuments mark the honest potter or the fair-dealing farmer. There was only the steady making day after day and the slow accumulation of trust that came with it. And that, unremarkable as it seems, was a real and lasting kind of honour. When the day's labour was finally set down and the light began to fade, the household turned inward once more, gathering in the soft close of evening. When the day's work was done and the light outside began to soften and withdraw, the household drew inward once more. Evening had a particular quality in an ancient home, a slow settling, a gathering back together of people who had been scattered through the labours of the day. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most important hours the family knew. The scene is a gentle one, the lamp lit again against the coming dark, its small flame steadying as it had the evening before, and the evening before that. The last of a meal cleared or shared, low voices, unhurried now, the sharp edges of the day worn down. the air cooling as the sun let go of the walls, and over everything a growing stillness, the sound of a house preparing itself for rest. Whatever the day had asked of them, the household was home now and together. Evening was when the small tensions of the day could ease, the frustrations of the market, the weariness of labour, the little frictions that gather among people who live closely, all of these could soften in the quiet. It was a time for talk, for the ordinary exchange of what had happened, for the small reports of the day, and it was a time in many households for stories, the telling and retelling that carried a family's memory, tales of those who'd come before, the old accounts of how things had been or how they had come to be. Through such stories spoken again and again around the evening lamp, a family reminded itself gently of who it was. And here lies something worth pausing on. It was not the grand gestures that truly built a family's name, not the fine seal or the rare dye or the inscription in stone, precious as those things were. It was this: the ordinary evenings, one after another, in which people ate together, spoke together, and remembered together. The trust that a family depended upon was not made in a single moment. It was woven slowly, night after night, from these quiet gatherings, so unremarkable that no one thought to record them, so essential that without them nothing else could hold. We should not imagine every evening peaceful, of course, nor every household the same. Homes differed with wealth, with region, with the century, and no family is without its harder nights. The evidence for such intimate hours is thin, for these were exactly the moments least likely to be written down. Much of what we picture must be reconstructed with care and held lightly. What we can say is only that the gathering itself in some form was near universal, because people have nearly always drawn together as the light fails. For there is a deep comfort in that drawing together, and it speaks to something the whole day's labour had been quietly guarding against. The loneliness that waits at the edges of any life was held back, for these hours, by simple belonging. The day's struggles were softened not by triumph but by togetherness, by the plain fact of familiar faces in the lamplight. And this reaching for one another did not end with the day. It stretched further still, beyond the living, toward those who'd gone before, and toward the ways a family kept faith with them. The care a family gave one another did not stop with the living. It reached back gently toward those who'd gone before. In many ancient cultures, remembering the dead was not a matter of sorrow alone. It was a way of keeping a family's name alive across the generations, of holding on to people who might otherwise slip entirely from the world. The forms this took were often quiet and small. A little offering set out in a chosen place. A portion of food or grain, a cup poured, a wisp of incense or a fragrant thing burned, so that its scent rose into the air, and perhaps simplest of all, the speaking of names, the name of a grandparent said aloud, the name of one who had died, kept in the mouths of the living, passed on to children who had never met them, but would carry them forward all the same. In this speaking, the dead were not entirely gone. They were held still within the circle of the family. There is something quietly profound in that act. To speak the name of someone who has died is to refuse for a moment their disappearance. It is to say that a life mattered, that it left a mark that it will not be let go of just yet. For families across many parts of the ancient world, this remembering was a duty and a comfort both, woven into the year through particular days and seasons, or simply kept as an ongoing tenderness, a habit of not forgetting. We must hold this carefully, for the practices varied enormously. How the dead were remembered, what was owed to them, and what was believed to become of them differed profoundly across cultures, regions, and centuries. Some peoples kept elaborate customs, others simpler ones. Some tied remembrance closely to belief about the afterlife. Others held it more as memory than as faith. To gather all of this under a single description would be to flatten a great and varied human landscape. The evidence too favours those who left records and monuments, while the humblest practices of ordinary families are the hardest to recover. And yet beneath all this variety runs a recognisable human thread. It is worth noticing how gently these practices sat within daily life rather than apart from it. This was not the remembrance of kings, carved into vast tombs meant to command the awe of centuries. For most families there were no such monuments. There was only a name spoken, a small offering left. An ordinary act of memory repeated by ordinary people who simply did not wish to forget those they had loved. In that difference lies much of what this whole story has been about. Grand history remembers the powerful in stone and inscription, but the far greater number were remembered, if at all, in these quiet and tender ways by the people who came after them. A name kept warm in the family's mouth was its own kind of monument, humble and unrecorded, but real, and such remembering was rarely left to chance. In many homes it had a place, a small and sacred corner where the living tended their bonds with the departed day by day. For many families, the remembering of the dead and the seeking of protection had a place within the home itself. Not a grand temple, not a public sanctuary, but something far smaller and more intimate, a niche in a wall, a shelf in a quiet corner, a modest household shrine tended daily by the hands that lived there. Let the image settle softly, a small recess set into the wall, perhaps, holding a few figures or simple objects held to be sacred. A little lamp or flame kept burning before them, its light steady in the dimness. An offering left there, a portion of food, a few grains, a cup, a fragrant thing, and a person pausing before it, hands folded, head bowed for a moment in the middle of an ordinary day. Nothing elaborate, nothing meant for outside eyes, just a quiet daily devotion, fitted into the rhythm of the household like any other of its tasks. Tending such a shrine was often a duty tied closely to the family's well-being. In many traditions, the small figures or presences honoured there were thought to watch over the home, to protect those within it, to help ensure the household's continuity from one generation to the next. To keep the flame lit, to leave the offering, to give the shrine its due care, was to look after the family's deeper safety, its bond with whatever powers or ancestors it turned to. And so this quiet devotion was, in its own way, another form of caring for the family's name, for a household kept the shrine much as it kept its good standing, faithfully and out of a wish to endure. There is a gentle contrast worth pausing on here. The ancient world had its great public religion, its grand temples, its processions and civic rites, the vast and visible face of faith. But alongside all of that, and often far more present in daily life, was this intimate domestic devotion. The small altar in the corner of the home, the private prayer, the personal offering, made not before crowds but in the quiet of one's own walls. For many people, this humble daily faith was closer and more constant than any temple could be. Household shrines and domestic devotions took countless forms across the ancient world, differing with culture, region, belief, and century. What was honoured, how, and by whom varied a great deal, and the meanings attached to these practices were not everywhere the same. Much of what survives comes from certain places and certain classes, and the private devotions of the poorest households often left little trace. The picture must be assembled gently from partial things, yet the feeling of it is easy to recognise. There is peace in a small ritual faithfully kept, comfort in the lighting of a flame, in the pause before a quiet corner, in the sense of care extended towards something larger than oneself. Such small devotions steadied the ordinary day. From these quiet daily rites, we turn now to the greater ones, the rituals that mark the largest passages of a life and a family through time. Beyond the small devotions of the ordinary day stood the greater rituals, the ones that marked the largest turnings of a life: birth, marriage, and death. These were the moments when a family paused, gathered, and made something visible before its community, and in each of them, quietly, a family's name was reaffirmed. Consider the arrival of a child. In many cultures, the naming of an infant was itself a ritual of real weight, a moment when a new person was formally received into the family and given a place within it. The name chosen might carry the memory of an ancestor, binding the newest member to those who'd come before. Gathered kin, a few words, perhaps an offering, and a new life was woven into the family's line. The household had continued. Its name would go on. Consider, too, the joining of a marriage. Ritual marked the crossing from one household life into another. Gathered kin, exchanged gifts, shared food or drink, and the formal crossing of a threshold. Such gestures made a private union visible to the community. We will return later to the deeper legal and social alliances that marriage could create, and consider the passing of the dead. When a member of the family died, the rites of mourning and honouring were not only expressions of grief, they were also a final affirmation of that person's place within the family and the community, a public acknowledgement that a life had been lived and mattered. Mourning cloth, gathered kin, the careful observances owed to the departed, all of it renewed the family's bonds even in the moment of loss, and confirmed its standing before those who watched. For these rites were watched. That is part of what gave them weight. Each was a public moment performed before neighbours and relatives, and the way a family conducted itself, whether it honoured its obligations and fulfilled what custom required, was noticed and remembered. There was, in this, a real social pressure, an expectation to be met. And yet within that public performance there lived also the most private of feelings, the joy at a new child, the tenderness or the uncertainty of a marriage, the raw grief of loss. The rite was public. The heart within it was the family's own. The two moved together, the outward form and the inward feeling, neither quite separable from the other. We should hold all of this with care, for the customs differed enormously. How births were marked, how marriages were made, how the dead were mourned, varied profoundly across cultures, classes, regions and centuries. What one people held essential, another did not practice at all. The evidence favours those who left records, and the rites of the poorest and least documented must often be imagined from fragments. No single description can hold them all, yet through every variation runs something we still know. These are the moments that shape a family in any age, and because such moments were shared, they carried the family outward, into the watchful world of the wider community beyond its walls. Beneath all the labour and the ritual we have followed, beneath the tended fire and the guarded seal, the shared table and the small offering, there lay a single quiet hope. That when a person was gone, they might be remembered kindly. So much of the daily effort of an ancient family was aimed, without ever saying so, at this soft and distant future. It is a tender thing to sit with. A man mending a wall, a woman at her loom, a family keeping its word in the market, an elder teaching a child an ancestor's name, none of them acting for the moment alone. Beneath these ordinary lives ran a quiet wish, to leave behind a good name, to be spoken of well after death, to be in some small way not entirely lost. This was not a grand ambition. It was something humbler and more human, the simple desire not to vanish without trace, and to be thought of with warmth by those who came after. We should be careful and light in how we speak of this, for attitudes toward death and remembrance varied enormously across the ancient world, shaped by belief, by culture, by class, by century. Some peoples imagine the dead as watching still, dependent on the living to keep their names alive. Others held gentler or vaguer notions. The evidence favours those who could afford to be remembered in lasting ways, and the hopes of the poorest are the hardest to recover. What we reach for here is not certainty, but a recognisable thread of feeling glimpsed across the distance of time, and that thread is easy to feel because it has not left us. The wish to be remembered kindly is not ancient in the sense of belonging only to the past. It is ancient in the sense of being very old and shared, and still alive in us tonight. The person listening now, wherever they are resting, carries some quiet version of it too, the hope that their small kindnesses will be remembered, that the people they love will think of them gently, that they will not be forgotten. There is comfort in that connection, rather than sadness, because it means the distance between us and those long-vanished families is smaller than it seems. They lit their lamps and kept their names and hoped to be remembered just as people do now. Across all the centuries, across every difference of language and custom and belief, this one soft wish reaches from their evenings to ours. The loneliness of being forgotten and the comfort of being held in memory, these are things we still know, exactly as they knew them. Picture, then, a modest stone somewhere, weathered, its carved name worn but not gone. Evening light lying across it, the air still. Someone long ago hoped that this name would be read, that this life would be remembered. And here, tonight, in a small way, it is. That hope was not in vain. A family might hope that its name would endure into a distant future. But before memory could carry that name forward, it first had to survive in the present, in the words of neighbours, in the judgment of the community, and within the laws that shape the household from beyond its walls. A family's name never lived within its own walls alone. It lived too out in the lanes and at the shared well, in the marketplace and the doorways that faced one another across a narrow street. For in the close-knit communities of the ancient world, a reputation was held not only by the family that owned it, but by everyone around them. Consider how near people lived to one another, homes crowded close, doorways opening onto the same lane, families drawing water from the same well, buying and selling in the same market day after day. In such a world, little went entirely unseen. Neighbours knew who rose early and who did not, whose children were well behaved, whose dealings were fair, whose household seemed in order, and whose seemed to be slipping. Much was noticed, and what was noticed was remembered and, inevitably, talked about. Gossip in such a setting was more than idle chatter. It was the very medium through which reputation travelled. A family's good name was carried in the mouths of others, spoken at the well, exchanged in greetings, passed from neighbour to neighbour, and this could work both ways. Kind words spread a good name, unkind ones could wound it. A rumour once loose was hard to call back. To live in such a community was to know that one was always, in some measure, being watched and spoken of, and weighed. And so ordinary people learned to move through this watchful world with care. They tended their conduct not only for its own sake, but because they knew it was seen. A courteous greeting, a fair transaction, a small kindness done to a neighbour in need. These were, in part, quiet investments. For the one you help today might speak well of you tomorrow, and in a time when reputation was carried by word of mouth, such goodwill was a real protection. Discretion, too, was valued. The wisdom of knowing what to say and what to keep, of not giving neighbours cause for unkind talk. There is a familiar tension in this, and it is worth naming gently. There was the self one showed to the watching world, careful, courteous, mindful of appearances, and there was the truer self within the walls of home, freer, less guarded, known only to the family. The two were not the same, and the gap between them was simply part of living among others. This was not falseness so much as the ordinary human care of managing how one is seen, something we still know well. We should hold our picture lightly, as ever, how communities watched and judged, and how much a family's fate depended on the opinions of neighbours, varied with place, with the size of the settlement, with class and custom and century. Village life differed from the anonymity of a crowded city quarter. The evidence favours certain voices, and the fuller texture of ordinary neighbourly life must be reconstructed with care. Still, the shape of it is clear enough and deeply human, yet neighbours and their talk were only one force shaping a family's name. Above and around this informal watching stood something more fixed and more formal, the structures of law that framed the family from without. Above the shifting talk of neighbours, more fixed and more formal, stood the law. In the ancient world, law reached into the life of the family in ways both large and small, binding a name to property, to inheritance, to standing, and setting the outer boundaries within which a household lived. Picture the instruments of it. A law inscribed upon stone, set up where it could be seen, a document sealed and stored, recording who owned what, who owed what, who belonged to whom. A hall where disputes were heard and people waited, and judgments were made. Through such things, the law fixed certain matters that a family could not simply decide for itself. Who would inherit a household's property when its head died? How a name and its holdings passed from one generation to the next? What standing a person held and what rights came with it? These were not left to sentiment alone. They were shaped often quite firmly by rule, for property and the family line were deeply entangled with law. A family's continuity, the passing of its name and its goods to the next generation, was in many places a matter the law took seriously, hedged about with formal requirements. Questions of who could inherit, in what shares, and under what conditions were answered through written law or customs carrying the force of law. Families wishing to protect their property and continuity needed to understand these rules and work within them. And yet we should be careful and gentle and not lose ourselves in detail here, for the law of the ancient world was not one thing. It varied enormously across cultures, cities, periods, and the standing of the people it governed. What held in one place and time might be unknown in another. Rights and protections that belonged to some were denied to others, differing sharply by class, by legal status, by whether one was free or enslaved, and often by whether one was a man or a woman. To speak of ancient law as a single system would be to flatten a vast and shifting landscape. The evidence, too, favours the propertied and the literate, whose legal affairs were recorded. What is worth holding on to is the relationship between the law and the life beneath it. The law shaped the edges of a family's existence, the formal boundaries of inheritance and property and standing, but it was daily routine that filled the centre. Within the frame the law set, ordinary people still lived their particular lives, made their small arrangements, found their own ways through. A statute might declare how property should pass, but the texture of the days, the labour, the meals, the raising of children, the quiet keeping of a name went on in the wide space the law left unspoken. And ordinary people were resourceful within those limits. Where the law was rigid, families found room to manoeuvre, working within its requirements to protect what mattered most to them, arranging their affairs as best they could for those they wished to provide for. Law set the rules, lived experience bent and softened around them. One of the most important places where law, family and name came together was in the joining of households through marriage, and it is there we now gently turn. Where law, family and name came together most visibly was in the making of a marriage. For a marriage in the ancient world was rarely the joining of two people alone. It was the binding together of two households, two lineages, two reputations, carefully brought into alliance with one another. Because so much rode upon it, a marriage was often arranged with real thought and care. Families considered not only the two who would wed, but what the union would mean for both houses, how it would join their standing, their resources, their names. A good match could strengthen a family, drawing it closer to a respected household, securing its place, extending its web of trust and obligation. And so the choosing of a match was, in many settings, a serious matter, weighed by elders and kin as much as by the couple themselves. The joining was marked by exchange, gifts passed between the households, tokens and goods that sealed the alliance and bound the two families in mutual obligation. Among what a bride carried into her new home there was often cloth she herself had woven, the fruit of long labour, a sign of her skill and of her family's care. Thresholds were crossed, a new household begun, and two names that had been separate were now, in some measure, joined. Within this, women often stood at the very centre, quietly carrying standing between households. A woman entering a new family brought with her the reputation of the family she came from, and became in turn part of how her new household was seen. She was frequently the living link between two lineages, the thread through which alliance was made real. This was a role of genuine importance, even where a woman's formal legal power was limited, for much depended on the bonds she helped to hold together. And yet, we should be careful not to reduce these unions to strategy alone. Alongside all the weighing of alliance and standing, there were, of course, human feelings, hope, affection, fear, tenderness, uncertainty. The couple were not only instruments of their family's interests, they were people, entering a bond that would shape the rest of their lives. Feelings and strategy mingled in proportions that surely differed from one marriage to the next, and that we can rarely recover. There was social pressure, the expectation to make a fitting match, and there was also personal hope, the ordinary longing for a good life with another person. Both were real. As always, the picture varied enormously, how marriages were arranged, what they meant, and how much freedom the couple had varied profoundly across cultures, classes, regions, and centuries. In some settings, unions were closely controlled by families. In others, there was more room for choice. The rights and roles of wives differed sharply from place to place. The evidence favours certain classes and certain voices, and the marriages of ordinary people must often be imagined with care. Not every union fit any single description. Still, the deeper truth holds. Marriage wove names together, joining what had been separate into something new. But names, once made, were not always safe. They could be threatened, and the question of how a wounded name might heal is where we turn next. A name, however carefully kept, was never entirely safe. It could be wounded, sometimes through a family's own missteps, but often through no fault of its own. Misfortune, conflict, or simple rumour could dim a reputation that had taken generations to build. And yet, quietly and without drama, families often found ways to mend what had been damaged. The threats came in many forms. A run of bad luck, a failed harvest, a debt that could not be met might cast a shadow over a household's standing. A quarrel with neighbours could sour how a family was spoken of. And rumour, that ever-present current running through any close community, could wound most easily of all. For once an unkind story took hold, it was hard to undo. A name could be diminished quickly, sometimes far more quickly than it had been earned. But it need not be diminished forever. This is the gentler truth worth resting on. Reputation, in most times and places, was not fixed and final. It was living, and living things can heal. A family whose name had suffered often set about restoring it in the plainest of ways, not through some dramatic gesture but through patience and time and the steady resumption of good conduct. Picture what such mending looked like: a garment carefully repaired, worn again with quiet dignity, a wall rebuilt, a household set back in order, a greeting offered and after a time returned, the small daily courtesies of neighbourly life gradually resuming, debts paid as they could be, work done honestly day after day until the memory of the wound began to soften and the family's reliability spoke for itself once more. These were patient hands at work rebuilding trust the same slow way it had first been built, a little at a time. There is real reassurance in this, and it is worth letting it settle. A family that stumbled was not necessarily lost. Given time and steadiness, and the quiet keeping of small promises, much could be recovered. The community that watched so closely could also, in time, be won back. People forget and forgive, and notice when a household has set itself right. A wounded name, tended with care, could slowly be made whole again. We should hold this gently as ever, for how much a name could be restored, and how readily, surely varied with the nature of the harm and with place, class, and century. Some wounds no doubt healed far more easily than others, and some, we must imagine, never fully did. The evidence for such quiet recoveries is thin, for they left few records. Much must be reconstructed with care. What we can say is only that reputation was tended and mended much like anything else in a household, and there is something quietly hopeful in that image, of a family patiently repairing its good name as it might repair a torn cloak or a crumbling wall. It reminds us that these were resilient lives, capable of endurance and recovery, not fixed in a single moment but always gently remaking themselves. So we have followed the name outward, from the home into the watching world. Now, softly we begin to gather all of it back together. We've travelled a long way through this quiet world, from the lamplit room to the watching street and back again. Now, as our journey begins to gather itself toward its close, let us return, softly, to the small things we met along the way, the objects. For if we look at them now with everything we have learned, we can see how much each one quietly held. Return first to the seal. That little carved stone, worn smooth, kept close against the body. We understand now that it was never just a tool, it was a family's word made solid, its trust and standing pressed into a fragment of stone small enough to hold in a closed hand. A whole world of agreements and reputation rested in that tiny mark. Return to the cloth. The garment woven over long hours, dyed or left plain, mended and kept whole, worn until it took the shape of the body. We know now that it spoke a language everyone could read, that it carried a family's dignity in its very threads, and that behind it lay the patient, unpraised labour of hands that clothed the whole household. Return to the worn cup, the treasured bowl, the darkened ornament passed from one generation to the next. We understand now that these were vessels of memory, holding the presence of those who'd gone before, letting a grandmother's touch reach forward into a child's small hands. Through them, a family felt itself continuing, and returned, finally, to the shrine in the corner. The little niche, the steady flame, the small offering left in the quiet of an ordinary day. We know now that this humble place held the family's deeper hopes, its bond with its ancestors, its wish to endure and be protected, tended as faithfully as the family tended its own good name. Gather them now in your mind, all of them together, in the dim and gentle light where we first found them, the seal, the folded cloth, the worn cup, the shrine, small things, every one. Nothing that would fill a museum's grandest hall. Nothing that a passing stranger would think to remark upon. And yet each one carried something immense, a piece of a family's memory, its trust, its love, its longing to be remembered. This is one of the quiet wonders of ordinary history, and it is worth pausing on. We tend to imagine that great meaning lives in great things, in monuments and treasures and the possessions of the powerful. But so much of what truly mattered was held instead in humble objects, used and worn and handed down, their significance known only to the people who loved them. A tiny seal, a plain cup, a mended cloak, each holding an entire world. We should remember gently that we see these things only partly. Many such objects are lost, and the ones that survive lean toward the wealthier households. The humblest keepsakes rarely lasted. Much must be imagined with care, yet the feeling remains true. For behind every one of these objects were the hands that made them, kept them, and passed them on, and it is to those hands and the people they belong to that we now gently turn. Behind every object we have gathered, behind the seal and the cloth and the worn cup, behind the tended fire and the welcoming table, there were hands. Ordinary hands doing ordinary work over and over across a lifetime. And it is to those hands and the people they belong to that this whole story truly owes itself. They are, so often, the people history barely recorded, the women who spun and wove and baked and drew the water, the elders who kept the family's memory and taught the children their names, the servants and the enslaved, whose labour sustained so many households and whose own names and stories were seldom written down at all. The countless ordinary members of ordinary families who rose before the light, kept the small promises, mended the cloth, banked the fire, and did it all again the next day, and the next, without praise and without record. Their work was quiet precisely because it was constant. The tasks that hold a household together are the ones that never announce themselves, the ones noticed only in their absence. No one wrote down the 1,000th loaf of bread, the 10,000th trip to the well, the endless evenings of tending and settling and keeping. These things left no monuments, and yet they were the very foundation on which everything else stood. Without them, no name could have been kept at all. Let us give them for a moment the soft attention they were so rarely given in their own time. Picture the worn hands themselves, roughened by grinding stone and loom and water jar, shaped by the work they did. Picture a figure at the loom in the failing light, or bent over the hearth, or carrying that heavy jar home once more. Picture the stillness of an evening earned by a long day's unremarked labour. These were real people, with inner lives we can barely glimpse, who spent themselves quietly in the keeping of their families. Here, more than anywhere, we must speak with care. These are exactly the people the records fail. Our sources were mostly written by and about the propertied, the literate, the men of standing. The daily labour of women, of the poor, of the enslaved, must often be reconstructed from fragments, from silences, from what we can reasonably infer rather than what was set down. We should not pretend to know their thoughts. We can only offer them a gentle, honest acknowledgement and admit how much of them is lost to us. And in that acknowledgement there is a quiet contrast worth feeling. Grand history remembers the kings, the generals, the names carved deep in stone and repeated for centuries. But it was not kings who kept the ordinary world turning. It was these unrecorded hands, the ones who never expected to be remembered and mostly were not, and yet without whom none of the rest would have been possible. So let a soft gratitude rest, for a moment, on all of them, on the makers and the keepers, the unnamed and the unpraised, whose steady care held everything together. And when we step back from these countless hands, we begin to see the larger pattern they wove, one long, unbroken thread running through all of human time. When we step back from all of it, from the objects and the rooms, the daily labour and the quiet rites, the watching neighbours and the countless unrecorded hands, a single shape begins to emerge. All of this careful effort, all of this tending of a name was really about one thing: belonging. That is what a name gave in the end. To have a good name was to have a place among neighbours, within a family, in the long line of those who came before and those who would come after. To protect it was to protect one's belonging, to secure a place in the web of trust that held a community together, and a place in the memory that would outlast a single life. Beneath the practical concerns of reputation and standing, this was the deeper thing being guarded, the wish to belong and to keep belonging even after one was gone. And so this whole story, from the lighting of a single lamp to the mending of a wounded name, has really been a story of love stretched across generations. The parents who kept their word for the sake of children not yet grown, the elders who taught the young an ancestor's name, the hands that made and kept and passed things on. All of it was a kind of reaching backward toward those who had gone, and forward toward those not yet born, an effort to hold a family together across the distance of time. Not fame, not glory, something far gentler and more enduring. The simple human wish to be part of something that continues. We should hold this gently and honestly, as we have tried to throughout. The particulars varied enormously, across every culture and class and century we might name. The evidence is partial, and ordinary lives must be reconstructed with care. We have not been telling the story of one people or one time, but tracing a thread that runs in different colours through many. What we can say is only that the longing itself seems very widely shared, and very old. And here is the quiet wonder of it. That thread does not stop with them. It runs on, unbroken, all the way to us, to you, resting and listening tonight. The wish to be remembered kindly, to belong, to matter to the people we love, to leave behind a good name in the hearts of others. This is not a relic of the ancient past. It is alive in us still, exactly as it was alive in them. Across all those centuries, across every difference of language and custom, the same soft longing reaches from their lives into ours. Picture, if you like, a long line of lamps stretching back through time, each one lit in its own small room, in its own evening, by people hoping to be remembered. And your own quiet light tonight is simply the newest among them, part of the same long, gentle thread of belonging that has never truly been broken. There is deep comfort in that, in knowing we are not alone in this, but part of something vast and old and tender. And so, softly we begin our return, back to a quiet room at evening, where this journey first began. And so we come back gently to where we began, to a small room long ago and a single lamp lit against the coming dark. It is familiar now, this room. We have learned something of the lives that filled it, and it no longer feels quite like a stranger's place. It feels almost like somewhere we have been before and are glad to return to. The lamp still burns low, its small flame leans and steadies, just as it did at the start of our journey, throwing its soft and shifting light across the cool stone floor, touching the folded cloth in the corner, warming the edges of the low doorway. The house has grown quiet. Whatever labours the day held have been set down. The fire is banked low, glowing gently beneath its coat of ash. And the whole household, unhurried now, is settling slowly toward rest. Outside, the street has gone still. The last cart passed long ago. Somewhere far off, a single dog has fallen silent. The evening air has cooled and the walls, which held the sun's warmth through the day, are letting it go, breath by breath, into the night. There is nothing left to do now, nothing that cannot wait until morning. The day is complete and the house knows it. Think for a moment of all we have carried into this room. The seal kept close, the cloth woven and mended, the cup passed down through careful hands, the small shrine in its corner, its flame long since tended for the night, the names spoken, the meals shared, the good name kept a little at a time. All of it is here, held quietly within these walls, part of the gentle weight of an ordinary evening. And all of it, in the end, so much like our own lives, in ways that reach across all that time. For the vastness of history has folded itself now into this one still room. The empires that rose and fell, the laws carved in stone, the great names remembered for centuries, all of it tonight has come down to this. A single lamp, a quiet house, a family resting under one roof, hoping in their small and human way to be remembered kindly. That was always where the real story lived. Not in the grand and the loud, but here, in the soft and the ordinary, in the tender centre of an evening like this one. And perhaps, as this ancient room grows dim, it begins to blur gently into your own. The evening around you now, the quiet of your own space, your own settling into rest. The distance between that far-off room and this one grows smaller and softer, until they seem almost the same, two evenings, two pools of lamplight, joined across all the years by the same simple wish for peace and belonging. So let the lamp burn lower, let the ancient room soften into your own, and let the long day, theirs and yours alike, come quietly to its close. It is time now to say goodnight. And so we have come, gently, to the end of our journey together. There is nothing more to learn tonight, nothing more you need to hold or follow, only a soft goodbye and the quiet that comes after. Thank you for spending this evening here, in these old rooms, among these long-ago lives. It is a quiet gift, to sit together like this in the dark, you wherever you are resting, and these gentle stories keeping you company for a little while. Whatever your day held, whatever you carried into this night, you can set it down now. It has waited long enough. It can wait until morning. Let the last few images fade softly, the way lamplight fades, the small carved seal kept safe, the cloth woven and worn and mended with care, the cup passed from one generation to the next, the little flame in its quiet corner, the names spoken tenderly around an evening fire. Let them grow dim now, one by one, like lamps going out across a sleeping town, until only the gentle dark remains, warm and safe around you. As you drift, remember only this. The wish to belong and to be remembered kindly is older than any of these, and you are part of that long human thread. There is nothing left to do now. No task, no worry, no story still unfinished. The house is quiet. The lamp is low. The night has settled all around and it asks nothing of you but rest. So let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and soft against wherever you're lying. Let your thoughts, if they wander gently, and then let them go, like the last thin ribbon of smoke rising from a dying fire, up and away into the dark. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to keep hold of. Only this quiet, only this peace, only this soft and easy drift towards sleep. Rest now. You're safe here. You're welcome here, always. Sleep gently, wherever you're listening from tonight. And whenever you are ready, whenever the night feels long or the quiet calls you back, there will be another evening waiting, another lamp lit, another gentle story to carry you toward rest. Until then, from the Sleepy History, good night, sleep well, and be well.